It has long been said that the original sin of America was the institution of slavery. Countless people have made the observation that America and its founders, while professing to be dedicated champions of the cause of liberty and equality, were actually hypocrites who invalidated their supposed commitment to true freedom by their ownership of slaves. If they were truly dedicated to the cause of human liberty, surely they would have immediately liberated all of their slaves and vehemently spoken out against it at every turn. Since they did not, they remain forevermore hypocrites. This, however, is not an accurate depiction of early America or of the Founding Fathers. It may surprise many to learn that the Founding Fathers actually acknowledged this tension in their own time. Many of them were appalled by the continued existence of the institution in the country, and often those who wrote the most about getting rid of slavery were slave owners themselves. Why then did they not at least liberate their own slaves? Why did they allow slavery to exist under the Constitution? Why was no plan put into place to abolish slavery? To understand the answers to these questions, we must first take a quick survey of history before the American Revolution. After all, America was not the first place to have slavery, nor was it the last. Slavery in actuality had existed around the entire globe for thousands of years. For millennia, it was viewed as perfectly natural that some were born to serve and some were born to lead. Slavery was how the lower classes were supposed to contribute to the preservation of civilized society. All races, religions, ethnicities, and genders were slaves at one point or another. It was only over time, through the spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, followed by many rebellions and the labor shortages that resulted from the Black Death, that slavery and serfdom began to be rigorously attacked. By the time of the settling of America, slavery and serfdom had largely faded away in Europe due to the aforementioned causes. How then was it introduced into the colonies of America? In short, the governments of Europe, who were being enriched by the cash crops of the New World, were either reluctant or firmly opposed to truly ending slavery, as it, alongside indentured servitude, provided the New World the much-needed labor to work the plantations that Europe profited off of. Furthermore, even if they wanted to, they were largely unable to effectively enforce law in the New World, leaving the economic enterprises of joint stock companies, slave traders, and labor-hungry plantations free from any restrictions on their institutions of slavery. On top of this, the argument was made by the ruling classes that owning such slaves were permissible, as they were actually war captives. Enslaving war captives was a tradition as old as time, and this time there was the added benefit, according to some, that slavery under Christian masters was beneficial to these pagan tribes, who could be brought up in true religion and civilized from their formerly backwards, idolatrous ways. With the explosion of wealth created by these new goods from the New World, eventually every European power developed a slave empire of its own, and worked steadily at making sure regular shipments of slaves could be delivered to its colonies. Initially, the distinctions between slaves and servants was not as clear as it would later become. In fact, there still exists debate as when the first slaves came to North America, since historians are not sure if the first Africans in Jamestown in 1619 were slaves or were legally distinct from slaves. In fact, the term slave was applied to white indentured servants as well as to blacks. Furthermore, these black and white slave servants did not live in a firm racial caste system. As David Williams reports in his book Rich Man's War, black and white servants worked together, played together, lived together, ran away together, and married each other. The brand of racism, all too common among later generations, was absent in the 17th century. Slavery, at this time, was also not a fixed, inheritable state of life. As Eric C. Sands states in his article Colonial Virginia Laws Related to Slavery, in the early years of the colony, individual slaves were able to win their freedom by demonstrating proof of their conversion to Christianity. In addition, enslaved persons were sometimes able to arrange to purchase their freedom, and policies regarding the status of children born to enslaved persons remained in flux until the mid-17th century. What then changed from the early colonial period to create the sort of slavery we're all familiar with that existed in the antebellum South? Perhaps one event is mainly responsible for this shift, the under-discussed Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion was an armed rebellion by Virginia settlers that took place in 1676. It was led by Nathaniel Bacon against colonial governor William Berkeley after Berkeley refused Bacon's request to drive Native Americans out of Virginia. Thousands of Virginians from all classes, including those in indentured servitude, and races rose up in arms against Berkeley, chasing him from Jamestown and ultimately torching the settlement. They were eventually defeated by Crown forces and the rebellion ended. Its legacy, though, was very far-reaching. The planters who dominated Virginia society were rightly terrified by the rebellion. The rebellion had been a direct threat to their power, wealth, and privilege. On the minds of slaves, servants, and poor farmers was a resentment toward the wealthy and the landed. Who knows what might happen in the future if a rebellion succeeded? The landed gentry knew they needed to adopt a strategy to ensure such a thing would never happen again. The solution? engender racial conflict instead of class conflict. As historian Edmund Morgan put it, for those with eyes to see, there was an obvious lesson in the rebellion. Resentment of an alien race might be more powerful than resentment of an upper class. In the decades following, colonial elites in the South did all they could to create this conflict between whites, Indians, and blacks. In the words of David Williams, interracial marriages were outlawed. Penal codes were amended to deal more harshly with blacks than with whites. Blacks became legally defined first as servants for life and later as slaves outright. In urban areas, only whites could hold certain occupations such as carpenter, blacksmith, mechanic, and the like. The separation of the races and the feelings such legislation engendered took their effects. Black slaves and indentured landless whites were no longer likely to unite against a common foe. Black slavery, as a result, flourished in the colonies with support from British slave trading ventures. Many in the American colonies, however, were economically and philosophically opposed to the proliferation of such slavery and its effects. In fact, as Robert Ingram reports, between 1726 and 1776, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed 28 laws to outlaw the importation of slaves into Virginia. All of these laws were nullified by the Royal Board of Trade and the King of Britain's Privy Council. James Oglethorpe, the founder and governor of Georgia, banned it in 1735, saying that the introduction of slavery into Georgia would occasion the misery of thousands in Africa. The trustees of the charter asked the House of Commons to repeal the ban on slavery in 1751. As many stood to gain more and more from slavery, both within and without the colonies, attempts to suppress slavery and the slave trade were increasingly marginalized. It was this world that the Founding Fathers were raised in, a society in which slavery and the domination of one race over another were taken for granted. The American Revolution, however, changed everything. As the colonists became more cognizant of their rights as Englishmen, many began to reflect on the rights of mankind. As the colonists questioned the domination of an island over another nation and the domination of an aristocracy over the people, many began to question similarly the domination of a master over a slave. Taking inspiration from the Bible, Oliver Cromwell, and the writings of Enlightenment thinkers, many colonists, especially those in the North, became extremely hostile to slavery. In fact, the first anti-slavery society in the world was formed in Philadelphia in 1775. As we have seen, though, in order to do anything about this slavery, independence from Great Britain, which benefited from American slavery, had to be achieved. Contrary to the ideas promoted by the 1619 Project, the American Revolution was in no way a war to preserve or save slavery. In fact, the army of George Washington was actually integrated, a feat that would not occur again until nearly 175 years later in 1948. The Continental Army also promised slaves their freedom in exchange for service. In the words of Alan Guelzo, even in the deep winter of Valley Forge, there were 750 black soldiers who were a part of Washington's army. If the American Revolution had been created for the purpose of protecting slavery, what were they doing? Perhaps Gordon Wood summarized it best. One obvious dependency the revolutionaries did not completely abolish was that of a nearly 500,000 Afro-American slaves, and their failure to do so amidst all their high-blown talk of liberty makes them seem inconsistent and hypocritical in our eyes. Yet it is important to realize that the revolution suddenly and effectively ended the cultural climate that had allowed black slavery, as well as other forms of bondage and unfreedom, to exist throughout the colonial period without serious challenge. As we know, the Revolutionary War was won, and we gained our independence from Britain. Why then did the revolutionaries not ban slavery? The reason why they did not is because it was impossible. More specifically, it was impossible to do so and remain one country. Massachusetts abolished slavery in 1783, and every northern state followed after it in the years to come. The South, however, was adamantly opposed to the abolition of slavery. After all, the planters who dominated the economy and politics of the South made enormous profits off of the system. If they were not allowed to keep their slaves, they would rather be out of the Union than in it. This posed an issue for anti-slavery founding fathers like Adams and Hamilton. While their own states worked to abolish slavery, they recognized there could be no United States of America unless the South could retain their slaves. While some might think it better to go alone rather than tolerate slavery, it was rightly recognized as a foolish idea. A divided America meant that Britain would have a much easier time isolating and reconquering the colonies, as they repeatedly tried to do either with arms or by espionage. On top of that, the two nations, North and South, would eventually go to war with one another over land disputes, and they would suffer great economic harm from the resulting trade wars. Disunion then was out of the question, but slavery still did not sit right with many of them. During the Constitutional Convention, slavery was debated at Independence Hall. As everyone knew that total abolition was out of the question, they debated the specifics of how slavery would work in the new republic. Many rose to speak out against slavery on an economic and moral basis, and many rose to defend it. At the end of the convention, they agreed that the import tax on slaves would not exceed $10 a head, that slaves would be counted for representation but would be counted in the proportion of 5 citizens to 3 slaves, thereby reducing the full power of the slave states. In return, the southern states conceded that the importation of slaves would cease in the year 1808. In the words of Catherine Drinker Bowen, the Constitution could not have gone through without the Slavery Compromise. The question before the convention was not, shall slavery be abolished, but it was rather, who shall have power to control it, the states or the national government? As the Constitution now stood, Congress could control the traffic in slaves exactly as it controlled all other trade and commerce. The control of slavery by the Congress was a serious concession on the part of the South. While their own slaves were protected, they could not now guarantee that they could bring them wherever they chose in the new territories. Congress having control of this power eventually led to the Civil War, whereby slavery was abolished. Still, some lament this compromise with the devil himself and denounce the Constitution as a slaveholder document. But it is interesting to note that Frederick Douglass, American hero and abolitionist, thought otherwise. He wrote a speech to demonstrate that the Constitution actually attacked slavery. In the Wikipedia article summarizing his speech, it says, Douglass argued that the 3/5 clause deprived slave states of 2/5 of their natural basis of representation, that the migration or importation clause allowed Congress to end the importation of slaves from Africa in 1808, that the fugitive slave clause does not apply to slaves but rather to persons held to service or labor, which do not include slaves because a slave is a simple article of property. He does not owe and cannot owe service, he cannot even make a contract. And that the clause giving Congress the power to suppress insurrections gives Congress the power to end slavery if it should turn out that slavery is a source of insurrection and that there is no security from insurrection while slavery lasts. Douglass also examined point by point the meaning of the objects contained in the preamble, which he listed as union, defense, welfare, tranquility, justice, and liberty. Douglass concluded that of the 6 objects, slavery is a foe of them all. On top of this, there was widespread belief at the time that slavery was naturally going to expire soon. The revolutionary sentiments of the Revolution had already resulted in the abolition of slavery in many states, and it was in keeping with this that more states would soon follow. Furthermore, the Northwest Ordinance, designed by Thomas Jefferson himself, banned slavery in the new territories in the Great Lakes area of the United States. Moreover, tobacco, the cash crop of the time, was wearing out the soil at alarming rates. Soon, if things kept going as they were, all of the soil across the American South would be depleted, and retaining slaves would cease to be profitable. It was not until the development of the cotton gin and cotton's importance in textile manufacturing that slavery exploded in the American South and experienced a new rebirth. So then, why did the revolutionaries not just free their own slaves? Maybe the political situation was too tricky, but certainly they could have done so for themselves, right? Well, freeing slaves was illegal in some states, such as Virginia, until 1782. Moreover, slaves were considered assets in the same way as property. This meant that if your estate was in debt, you could not free your slaves, as they were considered the property of your creditor. Such was the case for Thomas Jefferson. Other legal barriers, such as slave inheritance, prevented this. If your wife inherited slaves from her father, while they might have lived on your plantation, they were legally hers and you could not free them. This was the case for about half of George Washington's slaves. Certainly, now this was not the case for every one of the Founding Fathers. Some had no issue with slavery and even wanted it to spread. Others, while in principle against slavery, could not overcome the allure of its financial benefits and kept their slaves against their own consciences. But the reason most Founding Fathers would have given you as to why they still owned slaves would have been this: a change so momentous must be done gradually and legally. If every anti-slavery founder had freed their own slaves, not only would the freed slaves now be in a society that is generally hostile to them and have to provide for themselves often by sharecropping or reducing themselves to a practical form of slavery without property or homes of their own, but the now freed slaves would also serve as examples for those who were currently enslaved, resulting in agitation, of course rightfully so, from slaves toward masters. This agitation could result in slave revolts, which are extremely bloody and violent for both slave, master, and civilian alike. Slave revolts would also entrench among the planters the need to be more adamantly pro-slavery and keep slaves under stricter control. Jefferson argued that freeing slaves en masse could result in racial conflict and violence, potentially tearing apart the new republic. His fear was not just for white society, but also that freed black people would face hostility and economic hardship. He therefore proposed gradual emancipation combined with colonization, which would mean sending freed slaves to start a country of their own. Furthermore, the more politically important of them were in a sort of catch-22 with regards to their ownership of slaves. George Washington, for example, was crucial in preserving the unity of the American states. If he had taken a public stance on slavery, whether by word or by freeing them during his life, his ability to keep the country together and to unite it on acts of legislation would have been greatly reduced. This was the case even after his presidency, which is why he freed his slaves in his will after his death. Still, he commented on his repulsion to slavery during his life, saying, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it. But there is only one proper and effectual mode by which it can be accomplished, and that is by legislative authority." In short, the situation regarding slavery was very complex at the time. Whether these justifications were right or wrong, correct or mistaken, there were not always self-serving rationalizations of people who didn't care a lick about others and only prioritized profits. As Thomas Jefferson said, "As it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other."